I am extremely excited about today's interview. I was just talking with my wife before we went live today that it's been a while since I've been this excited about doing an interview on Capturing Christianity. It's we have, I think, 9 total clips pulled up to play for you guys. This is really exciting, and we wanted to say, at least at the beginning of this, some nice things about the interview, at least about Alex. So, Dr. Craig, go ahead and take it away. Say what you wanted to say about Alex before we look at some of these
Thank
clips.
you, Cameron, for having me on your program today. I have to say I'm thrilled to hear that Alex O'Connor has switched his handle and gotten rid of the Cosmic Skeptic. I encouraged him to do that. And I thought it was just remarkable how this young man, who is not yet a Christian believer, was able to press Bart Ehrman so hard in presenting the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. The audience might not realize it from Bart's calm and confident manner that at several points in this interview, O'Connor really has Ehrman's back to the wall, and Ehrman has to wriggle to escape. So well done, Alex. I was impressed.
Yeah, Alex did a really. I was equally impressed with Alex. But on the flip side, as I was listening to Bart, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do a sort of response video with Dr. Craig on this, is I was listening to Dr. Ehrman's responses. I just remember thinking, man, this is just not very good. Like, these responses just didn't really strike me. Like, and this wasn't like apologetics Cameron, like trying to just like come up with some reason why Christianity is true. This was just really honestly like listening to what he was saying and just being like, man, that's not it. That's not it, Chief. No. But like I said, I'm really excited to get into some of the actual meat of their conversation. So I think it starts at around the hour mark is when they start to talk about some of the work of Dr. Craig. And as I mentioned, we've got about 9 clips total that we'll get through, 8 clips from the interview, and then 1 other clip from another video, which we'll see which one that's from. But unless, Dr. Craig, you've got anything else you want to say at the beginning of this, let's go ahead and get into the first clip and just do as much damage as we can. So let's, here's the first clip. Before we get to the clips, one quick note on the clips. So since we have so many clips and so much stuff to get through, I actually sped them up. This is the first time I've ever done this on stream. I normally listen to YouTube at like 1.5 to 2 times speed anyways. So it's normal for me to speed up clips and like listen to things fast. So it's not going to catch me off guard like if I'm listening back to this. But just know that we did speed these clips up to 1.5 times speed. Okay, so it's going to sound sped up. It's going to sound a little bit weird, but we did that so that we could save time. So just quick note on that. All right, here we go. Here's clip number 1.
I had an episode with William Lane Craig, and he put forward a historical case for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And I remember in that podcast, I sort of listening back had wished that I pushed back a little more. And a lot of people actually noticed, and they said, I'm surprised that you didn't really give him a bit more grief for it. Yeah. But I figured that perhaps rather than making a botched attempt at doing it myself, it'd be better to ask you. I mean, his view on the matter, along with many others, is that we have a few facts about Jesus that we can pretty confidently say are true. Firstly, that a man called Jesus existed and was sort of going around teaching an ethical code of sorts and gaining followers, got into disrepute with the Roman authorities, was killed by crucifixion, and that afterwards groups of people claim to have seen him. Mm-hmm. Do you think that all of these facts are sort of well established?
Yes.
So given that, how do we explain the fact that all of these are true at the same time?
Oh, well, I don't see any trouble at all. We have other figures in history for whom we have things like that, with those 4 facts. I mean, Romulus, the founder of Rome, I don't know if he was a historical figure or not, but people thought he was, and he certainly ended up somehow leaving the earth, and people, there were eyewitnesses saying that they saw him alive afterwards.
Good. I mean, do we have sort of, firstly, are the sources as reliable? Are they as well attested?
Now that's another question. See, that's not one of your 4 things.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm asking about is when we say that these facts are well established.
Well, the historian Livy, so he's a Roman historian, and he reports that. Or Apollonius of Tyana. We have eyewitness testimony to his being raised from the dead.
Okay, so this first clip, just to quickly sort of summarize, so he says that Craig's 4 facts, well, these 4 facts are about Jesus, but they're easy to explain. Okay. And then we also have like testimony from Romulus and Apollonius, who they report these sort of similar like miracle claims and stuff, but we don't really believe those. And so these things can just be sort of easily explained away. So what is your response to this, Dr. Craig?
Well, first, I want to point out that Alex has got the 4 facts wrong that I appealed to for inferring the resurrection of Jesus. The facts that I appeal to are, first of all, that after his crucifixion, Jesus was interred in a tomb late on Friday afternoon by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Secondly, that on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered to be empty by a group of his female followers. Thirdly, thereafter, various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And finally, number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite every predisposition to the contrary. And those 4 facts are widely agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians today and supply an inductive basis for inferring to the resurrection of Jesus. So those are the facts that I'm staking my claim on, not the facts mentioned by Alex. Now, Ehrman's response to this is really puzzling. He agrees that the facts mentioned by Alex are historical facts. He admits that. But he says these are easily explained. Why? Well, because similar facts are attested by other figures in antiquity, like Romulus and Apollonius. Now, on the face of this is bizarre. Suppose someone were to say, how do you explain the facts of the assassination of John F. Kennedy? And you were to reply, oh, that's easy to explain. President Lincoln and President McKinley were also assassinated. Those events wouldn't do anything to explain the facts of the assassination of JFK. Moreover, those 2 individuals are historical persons, right? But in the case of Romulus and Apollonius, we're dealing here with mythological and quasi-fictional persons. Romulus is the figure in the myth of the founding of Rome, who supposedly founded the city about 750 BC. Ehrman himself, you notice, says, I don't even know if he was a historical figure or not. The first account of the founding of Rome by Romulus is from the 3rd century BC, so hundreds of years later after this supposed event. Apollonius of Tyana was a 1st century philosopher and magician, a kind of shadowy figure. Well, over 100 years after his death, the Roman Empress Julia commissioned the writer Philostratus to write a sort of romance novel of the life of Apollonius of Tyana. And so most of this is just fiction made up by Philostratus. And it is interesting that Philostratus was commissioned to do this by the Empress because she wanted to have a counterweight to the surging Christian movement in the early Roman Empire, and so wanted to create a kind of divine man figure to compete with Christianity. And so it's likely that Apollonius actually knew and used, or not Apollonius, Philostratus actually knew and used the Gospels in writing his life of Apollonius. John Alsop has written a authoritative book on the post-resurrection appearances in the gospel tradition. And here's what Alsop says. He says, it is very probable, in light of the chronological and biological factors, that Philostratus, in one sense or another, is dependent upon the gospel accounts, especially the Gospel of Luke, and maybe upon the Emmaus story. So these are in no sense comparable to the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, which were written down within the century of the eyewitnesses, within the generation of the eyewitnesses.
The only thing that I was going to say in response to this first clip is that, yeah, these were not the four facts that you mentioned: the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the appearances, and then the origin of belief. Like those are the four that you normally appeal to, and that those are way more difficult to explain than the ones that Alex mentioned in the clip there. And so I think, though, if Alex mentioned those, then Bart would have, because he balks later on. Well, we'll get to that clip when he talks about the empty tomb. So if he would have mentioned the empty tomb here, he would have mentioned what he's going to mention later on. But yeah, that was the only thing that I would have added there. You know what? I wanted to say this. So there's a friend of mine whom you know, a mutual friend of ours, Cesar Bernstein. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, indeed. I didn't know you knew him.
He and I are friends. He actually was the one who recommended we do this show together. He watched the interview on Bart Ehrman on Alex's channel, and he was like, you know what, you should have Dr. Craig on and have him respond to this. And I was like, you know what, that's a good idea. Let me reach out to him and see if he's interested.
Wow.
And he says hello.
He has done excellent work on the ontological argument for God's existence. Really provocative.
Yeah, he's defended the possibility premise, and super interesting stuff. But I just wanted to he sent me a text and said say hi for me. So
thank you.
So there you go. All right, let's get into clip number 2, where we talk about how William Lane Craig adds other facts. Here we go. Clip number 2.
Well, now, but see, now you're getting into other facts. See,
yes.
So the question is, what are facts? So if you're just talking about those 4 elements, then we certainly have those 4 elements. So they're not difficult to explain. What William Lane Craig wants to do, though, is to take those 4 facts and start adding others to them as if they were the same value.
What other facts are we talking about here?
Well, he says that we know that there was an empty tomb.
And you don't think that that's the case?
I don't know.
And one of the things that I think Dr. Craig might say on that point is that if people were claiming to have seen him, if people were claiming that this man had risen from the dead, the tomb was there. It was something people could have gone to check. And it would have probably been one of the first things that they did upon hearing that this Jesus figure had risen from the dead. If there were no empty tomb, surely someone would have discovered this. This is not good evidence confirming the idea that there was, in fact, an empty tomb.
It presupposes that he was buried in a tomb.
This is one of the facts that William Lane Craig thinks we can say is well established, that he was buried in a tomb. That's important to him. You don't think so?
No, I don't. I mean, that's the thing. He takes these 4 things that, basically everybody would agree on. There's a man, Jesus, got killed, and later people said they saw him alive. So that's fine. I mean, those 4 are easily explained. Was there an empty tomb? There are very big problems with thinking there was a tomb at all. He's presupposing that the gospel story is right, that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus the afternoon he was crucified and put him in a family tomb, and on the 3rd day, women came and found the tomb empty. Okay, so what is our evidence of it? Well, the evidence, of course, is only in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they say that. And it was the tradition the Christians had for a very long time. So it's certainly the Christian tradition. But there are lots of reasons for doubting that it's right, that he's never taken very seriously.
So, Dr. Craig, there are reasons for doubting the burial account that you don't take seriously. What is your response to this?
What must not be missed here is the concession that Bart Ehrman makes to Alex O'Connor. Ehrman concedes that if the burial narrative is historically reliable, then it becomes extremely difficult to deny the historicity of the empty tomb. Because if the burial story is accurate, that implies that the site of Jesus' grave was known to Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. And therefore, when the disciples began to preach the resurrection of Jesus, that tomb had to be empty in order for belief in the resurrection of a dead man to originate and flourish in the very city where he was publicly crucified and his tomb was known. So that means that Ehrman is in the very difficult position of having to disprove the burial account. The person who believes in the empty tomb doesn't need to prove the burial story. He can have other reasons in support of the empty tomb account. But the burial account is the sine qua non of the empty tomb story. If you're going to deny the empty tomb, then you've got to disprove the burial account. Well, we've got good reasons to believe that the burial account is reliable. We have at least 5 independent sources in support of the burial account. Moreover, the burial of Jesus by a member of the Sanhedrin, rather than by his beloved disciples or by his family, is unexpected and therefore very unlikely to have been a fictional or legendary creation in the early Christian community. And therefore, the vast majority of scholars, virtually all New Testament scholars, agree that the burial story of Jesus' corpse in the tomb by Joseph is historical. Now, Ehrman asserts that there are lots of reasons to doubt that Jesus was buried, but you notice he never says what they are. Instead, he immediately changes the subject. So if Ehrman is going to disagree with the almost unanimous opinion of New Testament scholarship that the burial account is credible, then he needs to give us what these overwhelming reasons are.
Yeah, true. And then he asked, "What is our evidence of the empty tomb?" I suppose we can get to that in a second. I did want to bring something up really quickly.
Well, I did mention two facts, Cameron. That namely, it has multiple independent attestation in at least five different sources.
Independent
and that's
sources.
one of the most important evidences for historicity. And then also the unlikelihood of a burial of Jesus by a Sanhedrist, a member of the very council that had condemned Jesus.
So I did also want to mention, in addition to that, we've got an article on Capturing Christianity that was written by what is now an anonymous author, but it's outlining 9 reasons why Joseph of Arimathea was a real historical figure. So if you go to capturingchristianity.com, type in Joseph of Arimathea, you can find this article very quickly. It outlines 9 different reasons. We're not going to go through all of these reasons right now, but you can kind of see them. If you want to, you can pause the video and kind of look at them here, or you can just go to the website and read through them. But here are 9 reasons. This is based on actually a book. This is a book review of Jesus in Jerusalem, the Last Days. So go check that out. We've also got an article on our website that is entitled 8 Strong Arguments for the Empty Tomb, which is based on actually the book The Sun Rises by Dr. William Lane Craig, the guy who I've got here with me today. And he outlines on page, I had the page pulled up, maybe I don't have it anymore, but when you start to talk about the empty tomb, you give, I think, 7 or 8 lines of evidence for the burial narratives. But one thing, or I guess a couple things that I wanted to ask you about, some additional lines of evidence that you haven't really mentioned here, but you mentioned in your written work, is what about the Shroud of Turin? Do you think the Shroud of, is it Turin or Turin?
Turin, or in Italian, Torino.
Okay.
But I don't
Do you think that provides any evidence for the burial account?
Until the authenticity of the shroud is proved, I don't think it's wise to appeal to it. It certainly is a stunning artifact. No one knows how to explain the image of the man on the shroud. But until those carbon dating tests that showed it to be medieval are decisively reversed, I think it has a question mark behind it.
So how about this? Would you support the conditional, if the Shroud of Turin were authentic, then the burial account would be accurate, or something along those lines?
Oh, yes. I think that it strongly supports the burial account that we have in the Gospels.
If it were authentic, it depends on the probability that you think that the shroud is authentic. So for people who do think that the shroud is authentic, then it would lend incredible support for a burial account. So this would be good archaeological evidence, apart from any sort of like biblical or written evidence or oral evidence.
You can't get more tangible physical evidence than something like the shroud.
So what about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Because you've talked about that in your Defenders.
Why Ehrman didn't mention that, because there is a very plausible historical claim that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem does in fact stand on the site of Jesus' tomb. We could go into that if you want, but I don't know if we have time.
No, we don't have to go into any details. I just wanted to see if you think that it does get, and then we can point people to go check it out for more if they'd like to look into it further.
I think it has a very plausible claim to rest on the site of Jesus' burial.
Okay. All right. Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's move on to clip number 3, where Ehrman has
I forgot to say anything about the evidence for the empty tomb. I talked about the burial. But let me just run through a few evidences for the empty tomb. Namely, wholly apart from the burial account and its credibility, there are at least 6 independent sources for the empty tomb, some of which are among the earliest source materials in the New Testament, such as the pre-Markan Passion story. Secondly, the Markan account of the discovery of the empty tomb lacks signs of legendary embellishment or theological reflection that you would expect to find in a later legendary account. Thirdly, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. Any conceivable motivation for having women be the discoverers of the empty tomb would have been better met by having male disciples discover the tomb, given the low status of women in a patriarchal culture and their inability to serve as credible witnesses. And then finally, number 4, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes that the tomb was empty. The earliest Jewish polemic, which I think goes right back to early Jewish Christian disputes in Jerusalem, was that the tomb or the body of Jesus was stolen by the disciples. Now, think about that for a minute. The disciples stole the body. That Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection presupposes that the body was in fact missing. It presupposes the historicity of the empty tomb. So rather than point to an occupied, closed tomb, all the Jewish authorities could do was enmesh themselves in this absurd debate about the disciples stealing the body. And so for reasons like these, again, I want to say that the wide majority of New Testament historians today do agree that, in fact, the tomb of Jesus was found empty on early Sunday morning by a group of Jesus women followers.
I think also what we're going to see in some of the future clips is some of the reasoning that Ehrman has used that's led him to reject the burial account, the empty tomb and stuff. Especially in this next clip, we're going to see some of this Humean reasoning start to that sort of seeped in to his reasoning, and we're going to highlight that and sort of highlight what's wrong with it.
What is ironic about this is that Ehrman himself, in his lectures on the historical Jesus with the teaching company, actually affirms the historicity of the burial and empty tomb. This is what he says, if I can quote. He says, with respect to Jesus' burial and empty tomb, the earliest accounts we have are unanimous in saying that Jesus was in fact buried by this fellow, Joseph of Arimathea. And so it's relatively reliable that that's what happened. We also have solid traditions to indicate that women found this tomb empty 3 days later. So that's what Ehrman used to teach about the historicity of the burial and the empty tomb of Jesus. And I think it was only after he saw where this was leading that he began to backpedal then and tried to deny the burial and empty tomb stories.
All right, let's get to clip number 3, where Ehrman has a Humean understanding.
Somebody last week was interviewing me and replaying some things where he was trashing me for some debate we had 20 years ago, where he said that, the only reason I reject the resurrection is because I've got some kind of warmed over Humean understanding of things, and I've never read Hume. It's like, it is just so wrong. It's just like, it's just factually wrong. But apart from that, he says that I'm not a historian. I don't know what he thinks. I do know what he thinks I am. He thinks that I'm a textual critic, whatever he thinks that is. And that's just completely wrong too. It's just like he knows nothing about me, but he's making stuff up.
Okay, so yeah, you're factually wrong. You say he's not a historian. You know nothing about him, and you're making stuff up.
Yeah, what is a textual critic? A textual critic is someone who is an expert in reconstructing the original text of the New Testament. He compares manuscript evidence and on that basis reconstructs what the original reading of the text in the New Testament was. He's not a historian, he's a textual scholar. And that's what Bart Ehrman was trained in. Now, don't take my word for it. Get the Wikipedia article on Bart Ehrman and read it. And there you will read that Bart Ehrman earned his BA from Wheaton College. He then earned a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. And then finally, he took a PhD where, and I quote, he studied textual criticism of the Bible, development of the New Testament canon, and New Testament Apocrypha under the great textual critic Bruce Metzger, and worked with Metzger in establishing the critical edition of the Greek New Testament. And so here are the titles of Ehrman's scholarly works: Didymus the Blind and the Text of the Gospels, the text of the fourth gospel in the writings of Origen, the orthodox corruption of Scripture, the effect of early Christological controversies on the text of the New Testament, the text of the New Testament in contemporary research, the text of the New Testament, its transmission, corruption, and restoration, studies in the textual criticism of the New Testament. So I'm just baffled that Bart Ehrman would want to walk away from his fine work in textual criticism and his expertise in that area. But the fact is that when he claims to be a historian, this is mere posturing. He has no training or degree in history. He's a textual scholar, and in his popular level books, he likes to posture as a historian. Now, what about the claim that he uses an argument against the resurrection and miracles from David Hume? Well, in a recent interview that I did with Kevin Harris, Ehrman repeats this same Humean sort of argument that was featured in this debate that he and I had 20 years ago. And I explained at that time why this argument is demonstrably fallacious. And what I was shocked to hear was Ehrman propounding the same line today, namely that a miracle is so improbable that it cannot be established to be probably historical. And that is a patently fallacious claim that derives from David Hume's essay of miracles in the mid-18th century.
But what's weird is that he says that you're factually wrong about this. It seems like he's saying that he doesn't have a Humean understanding. He's not coming from Hume. He's not giving a Humean argument. However, like you said, he just gave one. Let's actually play the clip. I've got the clip pulled up. Let's play the clip from this interview with Pelagia, and let's hear him for himself, like his own words.
The question is, if you've got reports of something, how do you evaluate its probability? Historians can only establish probability. That's all historians can do. And so, if you have an event such as Romulus ascending to heaven, which after Romulus allegedly ascended to heaven, there was a senator who came forward and said that Romulus had come down to him and talked to him and told him and explained it to him, and he saw Romulus afterwards. Okay, so that's a historical report. So, if you get that as the historical report, you have to ask, did it happen or not? Now, you don't say, well, it couldn't happen because nobody's ever done that. That isn't what you don't say. It couldn't have happened because of that. You say, okay, what are our options for explaining why somebody told that story? So somebody will say, well, it's somebody who wanted the Roman people to think that Romulus had become a divine being, which they did, as the god Quirinus. Or you could say that it was a senator who wanted to hide up the fact that the senators actually had killed Romulus and hidden his body. Or you could say, you come up with your list of explanations. Okay, these are the possible explanations. Now, which one is more probable? Is it more probable that he ascended to heaven and became the god Quirinus? Or is it more probable that the senators who hated him killed him? Which is more probable? It's not that it's a unique fact. I mean, it's going to be unique either way. The question is, which is more probable? And this is where his warmed over Hume comes in, which it comes in for him as well, because he uses it with Romulus. It's more likely that people who do this kind of thing all the time did this kind of thing in this case than that he did something that's like so spectacular, it's like it's never happened before or since. That makes it more likely. So it's not the singularity.
So he literally says that he does it, but then he also says that you do it too. So he's not denying that he does this sort of reasoning. He's saying that you do it too.
And how do I do it too?
Well, he's saying that I think he's saying that like everyone does it. So like when it comes to Romulus, everyone just denies that he was this miracle worker that ascended to heaven or anything like that. So I think that I think he's saying like everyone, when they approach that story, they become a little warmed over Hume.
He's confused here between the facticity of the Romulus story and the best explanation for some purported historical fact. As I pointed out at the beginning of this podcast, the stories of Romulus and Apollonius of Tyana are mythical and quasi-fictional, so there's nothing to be explained. By contrast, we have good historical evidence for such things as the burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the origin of the Christian faith. And so given those facts, the question now becomes, what is the best explanation of them? And Ehrman's claim is that the supernatural explanation or miraculous explanation is always less probable than some naturalistic explanation. And that is demonstrably fallacious. That is Hume's argument, is that it's impossible to identify any event as a miracle.
And that was basically what he was saying with Apollonius just now in that clip. He's saying, we've got this pool, you come up with your pool of explanations that explain the data, and then you pick the one that is the most likely. But what he excludes is any explanation that is sort of miraculous or supernatural or anything like that. And so, and then he just applies the same standard to the resurrection, And this was kind of what Hume did, is like any testimony of the miraculous, like what is more likely, that it's a miracle or that the person who's giving the testimony was lying or mistaken or something like that.
Right.
And that's basically what Hume was arguing. Now, I do have a couple questions for you. You've mentioned in your work Hume's abject failure a couple times as a good resource for people that are interested in this question of David Hume and whether or not his arguments hold any water. But I was wondering,
by the philosopher of science John Ehrman.
Yeah, not Ehrman, but Ehrman,
right?
Or Ehrman. It's spelled Ehrman. Right. It was a really good book. I really enjoyed that one. But another book that I'm curious if you've read or heard about is called Hume, Holism and Miracles by David Johnson.
No, I don't know that book.
So this one is my favorite book that I've read on this subject, on this particular subject, and I recommend to everyone to go pick this up. I actually got lucky, and I got this for like $10 on Amazon. It was on sale one day. But I enjoyed this one a lot because, well, A, it was shorter, but then B, he really shows how David Hume was just quite clearly begging the question. And so it was just a really, really good, succinct book on the problems of David Hume. So I just wanted to give a quick plug on that one. All right, let's go ahead and move on to clip number 4. If I can find my mouse to scroll up in our notes here. This one is what happened to crucified victims. What did Romans do to the crucified victims? Here we go.
We do have a number of references to what Romans did once the person died on the crosses. And the accounts are consistent that what they did is they left them on the crosses as part of the humiliation.
Yes.
That they would decompose on the cross and be attacked by scavengers. And so we have off-the-cuff remarks in a number of sources that that's just what they did. And so there are debates about that. We can have debates about whether that happened within Judaism or not. People say, yeah, Jews didn't allow that. That's absolutely right. Jews didn't allow it. But the Jews weren't killing him. The Romans were killing him. and so forth and so on. So,
okay, yeah. So multiple accounts say they left him on the cross. Jews wouldn't have allowed it, but Romans did it. Right.
So we're back to the question of the historicity of the burial narrative. And as I've already explained, by far and away, most scholars are convinced that in Jesus' case, the body was not left on the cross, but it was taken down and interred in a tomb. And I think, as Ehrman hints in his reply, you cannot let Roman practice outside of Judea indicate or dictate what they did in Judea. Pilate respected Jewish sensibilities in order to keep the peace. And the Jewish authorities would want the body taken down from the cross before nightfall, especially because of impending Passover, one of the holiest days, because the body left on the cross would defile the land. And so I think we have really good evidence that that a Sanhedrist did assume responsibility for interring the body of Jesus in a tomb. And I would mention as well that we actually have archaeological evidence that victims of crucifixion in Judea were properly interred in a tomb. There was an archaeological discovery of a man named Yehohanan, which still had the crucifixion nail in the ankles with a piece of wood from the cross affixed to it, because apparently the nail had hit a knot in the wood and bent so that it could not be extracted. And the fact that this was preserved shows that the body was put into a tomb where the flesh would decay, and then it was placed into an ossuary or bone box. Let me cite an important article from the New Testament scholar Craig Evans on the burial of Jesus that is relevant to this. He points out that in a recent publication, Bart Ehrman has embraced the dubious hypothesis of John Dominic Crossan that the body was left on the cross. Evans comments, "I am not aware of any archaeologist or historian who accepts this quirky argument. Roman legal material explicitly states that the bodies of the executed, if request is made, can be taken down and given proper burial." And he references De Gesta, chapter 48. Our surviving literary evidence suggests that the bodies of those who were executed in and around Jerusalem during peacetime were not only permitted to be buried, but were expected to be buried before sundown on the day of death. This was done in order to preserve the purity of the land. Josephus, writing in the 70s, states that in his time, even the bodies of, quote, those sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset, end quote. That's from Jewish War, chapter 4, section 317. Because only Rome possessed capital power in Judea and Samaria in the time of Jesus, this means that those crucified by Roman authority were nevertheless permitted burial according to Jewish law and custom. Those executed or crucified were buried, and in fact, from the Jewish point of view, had to be buried to prevent the defilement of the land. Josephus remarks that during peacetime, the Romans did not require the Jewish people to violate their laws and customs. That's from Against Appian 2.73. And then he mentions the skeletal remains of Yehohanan, and he says these are not the only evidence for the proper burial of a victim of crucifixion. The remains of a man, both crucified and beheaded, were recovered from what is now called the Abba Cave, once again in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Givat HaMiftar. Nails were recovered from the ossuary. One nail was still embedded in the man's hand. So we have literary evidence as well as archaeological evidence that in Judea during peacetime, the Romans respected the Jewish custom of immediate burial of crucified victims on the day of crucifixion.
Sorry, I've got a dog barking in the background. Someone just rang the doorbell. So if you hear some barking back there, just try not to pay too much attention to it. Try not to be too distracted. I actually wanted to pull up. Oh, we got a little bit of echo there. I wanted to pull up a scripture passage from Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 through 23, which supports this idea from Craig Evans that, well, let me just read it out here. So it says, "And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." And so that's like the Jewish custom of the day. That was,
Yes.
I believe, the first time that I saw this was in the book that was co-authored by Craig Evans and N.T. Wright called Jesus the Last Days. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Really, really interesting verse, actually relevant to the whole debate here. So
Yes.
with that, let's go ahead and unless you've got anything else to add there, let's go ahead and jump to clip number 5. Okay, and clip number 5 is where he says, "No other account exists of anyone being buried on an afternoon of crucifixion." Here we go.
I don't know of any instance where we have a verified account of anybody being buried on the afternoon of their crucifixion in a known tomb. So how likely is it that they made an exception in the case of Jesus? I mean, we think they would because, he's the Son of God, and so he's exceptional. But, I mean, Pilate didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God. He was just one of the guys who's crucifying that morning.
It's still quite an exceptional case. I mean, Pilate seems quite distressed at the fact that Jesus ends up going to...
According to whom?
To crucifixion. Well, according to the gospel
The
narrative.
Christian narratives.
But this is a
He
possibility.
crucified, it's possible. It's possible he's more upset about one of the other two guys.
If it is true that you have an instance of Pilate really not thinking that this man ought to be crucified and asking the crowds...
No, but I don't think that's historical. Why would we think that's historical?
I guess I'm not trying to make the case that it's... That we can know that this is the case. But this might be an explanation as to why we do have an instance of the Romans making an exception when it comes to sort of leaving someone on the cross. Because Jesus was exceptional, not just because he was the Son of God, because, of course, I don't believe that, and the Romans wouldn't have believed that, but that it was still an exceptional case.
Why?
I guess in the case of Pilate, this might have been someone who he really didn't think deserved to be crucified.
Why?
Because this would be the case if the gospel narratives are correct,
Yes.
if what's written there is correct.
That's right.
Again,
That's
I'm not claiming to be able to say that we know that they are, but if they were, this would offer an explanation of
That's
how we
right.
have an exception.
But the argument then is, if the gospel narratives are correct, then the gospel narratives are correct. And so that's not an argument.
Okay, so we've got here, no reason to think that Jesus is an exception to the rule, and then relying on Gospels for information about the burial account is circular.
Yeah.
What is your response?
As we just saw from the literary and archaeological evidence, Jesus was not the exception to the rule. Taking the bodies down and burying them on the day of crucifixion was the rule that was followed in Judea. Moreover, the reason that Jesus was treated that way, or the reason that we should think he was treated that way, is not because he was the Son of God. Rather, it's because we have very good reasons to believe that the burial narrative is credible. And it is evidence that has convinced virtually all scholars today. And that's not circular because we have good reasons to think that the gospel narratives about the burial are correct. Remember, I mentioned that we have multiple independent attestation in at least 5 different sources, some of which are among the earliest in the New Testament, such as the pre-Pauline formula quoted in 1 Corinthians 15 and the pre-Mark and Passion story. And this is one of the best tests of historicity, is to have multiple independent and early testimony to a particular event. Moreover, we saw that the burial of Jesus by a Jewish Sanhedrist is unlikely to be a Christian invention. This is the criterion of embarrassment at work. Something that would be an embarrassment to the early Christian movement is likely to be historical because it's unlikely to be made up. And for these reasons, the evidence in favor of Jesus' burial has convinced virtually all New Testament scholars.
So one thing that I wanted to sort of pick up on here is Bart seemed to, or Dr. Ehrman seemed to sort of appeal to an argument that, like, and this was one of the things that I was mentioning at the very beginning of the stream, where I was listening to him, listening to this interview, and I was just like, that is so wrong. That is so wrong. And it was when he was saying, well, you can't really trust it if it's in the Gospels, and you can't really trust that, right? Because it's circular. It's almost like you're trusting it because it's there, something along those lines. And so I wanted to just say that what you're doing, if you're reading the Gospels and you're believing it because it's in the Gospels, what you're doing is you're treating the Gospels as testimony. And that's a completely normal thing to do. So, like, suppose that you hear you're a juror in a court case, okay, and you hear, and all that's available is the testimony of someone who was sexually assaulted, and that's all the evidence that you have to go on. In that case, like, would it be circular to rely on the testimony of the person who is claiming that they were assaulted? No, that wouldn't be circular at all. You'd be relying on the testimonies. Testimony is a very well-known source of justification. You can actually go look that up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of the journal article on epistemology. You can look that up. Testimony is a valid source of justification. So this is not controversial in philosophy at all. So, and then I think that this is also why it's super important, like, before you come to conversations about evidence, it's important to have your epistemological grounding. And this is why philosophy is so important. You've got to know epistemology. This is one of my sayings that I love. Epistemology covers a multitude of sins. Good epistemology covers a multitude of sins. If you have like a good epistemology, you're going to weed out a lot of like bad inferences and bad thoughts that you're going to have along the way when you're trying to evaluate a case like this. And so another thing I wanted to mention is Swinburne's principle of testimony. So what he says, what Richard Swinburne argues, is that when it comes to testimony, unless you just want to be a skeptic about basically everything that you hear from everyone, you've got to operate on the assumption that what you hear from other people is true unless you've got reason to doubt it. So basically, you've got to work on the assumption that what you're hearing from people is accurate unless you've got a reason. So it's not to say that you just believe everything, but rather it's to say that you believe it on, with the clause, unless you've got sufficient reason to doubt it. Okay, so when someone's coming at the Gospels, they're reading it and they're saying, this just seems like this is what they were reporting they saw, and this is what happened. And I don't really have any reason to doubt this. And so I'm just going to believe this. And there's epistemologically zero wrong with that.
And with regard in particular to the burial of Jesus, Ehrman doesn't have any reason to think that this is not historical. All he can point to is general Roman practice outside of Judea, but doesn't draw the relevant comparisons in first century Israel.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You've got to show that this is what was going on in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even then, you're still relying, I mean, I haven't even really talked about this yet, but you're still, at that point, you're still relying on the sort of frequentist interpretation of probability, where the probability of some event occurring in history is determined by how many times it happened elsewhere, or like how many trials of that event occurred in history. So like you might as well just argue that like most people don't rise from the dead, so Jesus didn't rise, and like that's your argument for why Jesus didn't rise back from the dead. Like just say that. Like if that's ultimately what you want to say, like you don't have to go through all of these different steps and deny all these different historical facts. Just say that. But apart from that, like a frequentist interpretation of probability is the wrong interpretation of probability. And I feel like we're kind of getting into some of the weeds here, but I think that's ultimately like we're getting into like the heart of the matter. And I think this is why, again, philosophy is so important, is because if you don't really know your philosophical assumptions going into it, then you're going to make inferences where you don't know the assumptions behind them. You don't know that what you're doing is you're assuming that frequencies are going to determine the probability of some historical event, whereas that is just, in general, the wrong way to go about determining probabilities. And so unless you've got anything else to add on that, we can go ahead and move on to number 6.
It recalls to mind an illustration that John Ehrman gives in the book you referred to, where scientists have been investing millions of dollars and thousands of man hours trying to detect an event of proton decay, and they have yet to do so. Well, on a frequency model of probability, it would therefore have a 0 chance of occurring, and all of those man hours and millions of dollars are being squandered for something that could never happen. And that's obviously absurd and shows that this frequency model of probability is simply wrong.
Right. Right. And then it doesn't account for the fact that there can be anomalies. You can have some anomalous event occur even when most other things happen some other place, some different thing happens in a different place, right? And so and especially historical events like that, those sorts of things happen all the time, especially in different cultures where different things are allowed. Right. So these are the sorts of these are the sorts of factors that you have to take into consideration when you're trying to do some sort of historical analysis. You've got to take in those cultural considerations. But then you've also just got to reject frequentism as an interpretation of probability. You got to get rid of that, and you got to lean on something like an inference to the best explanation, or you've got to lean on something like a Bayesian type view of probability. You've got to lean into something that's more respectable as an interpretation of probability. All right, let's get into clip number 6, and we're kind of running out of time, so we'll get through these as quickly as we can. So clip number 6 is what ultimately needs to be explained here.
Now, a moment ago you said that, okay, William Lane Craig is wrong because he says that we can know there's an empty tomb, and we can't. It seems to me a relatively minor detail in that you said, we have these 4 facts, including that Jesus was crucified, and including the groups of people claimed to have seen him after he died. You say,
I'm not sure groups of people claimed.
Okay, this is what I wanted to pick up on when you said that this can be easily explained. What is it that you think can be explained? The fact that we have records of groups claiming to see Jesus, the fact that groups did actually claim to see Jesus, the fact that individuals claim to see Jesus. What are the things that you think, this isn't troubling for us to explain without having to invoke a resurrection?
I don't think it's troubling to invoke the idea that there were individuals who claimed they saw Jesus alive afterwards. I don't think we have good attestation for it. I think the Apostle Paul claims he saw Jesus alive a few years afterwards. And so I think, I don't think he's lying about it. I think he probably thought he saw Jesus.
Paul, also being our earliest source of the New Testament, claims at one point that Jesus appeared to 500 people.
That's right.
This seems to be some good evidence that we do have.
No, I don't think so. Paul knows there's a story that 500 people saw him. But I don't think that's evidence that 500 people saw him. That's a claim. And so a claim isn't evidence. Evidence is when you try to substantiate the claim. And so how do you go about establishing whether 500 people actually saw Jesus? Well, you look at what Paul says, and then you see are there other sources to corroborate it. Paul's writing before the Gospels. None of the Gospels mentions anything about this, or the Gospel sources. So Paul's our only source. And so is he right or not? Well, it seems like if 500 people saw him, that this would be something that other people would mention. So I don't think we know.
Yeah, so a good attestation for appearances. No, there's no good attestation. Claim isn't evidence. Evidence is when you try to substantiate the claim. And then is there any evidence that corroborates the 500 claim?
Yeah, here we move now from a discussion of the empty tomb and burial to a discussion of the postmortem appearances of Jesus. And the fact is that the appearances of Jesus alive after his death that are listed by Paul in this very old tradition that he hands on in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 show that these resurrection appearances to different individuals and groups are multiply attested. And the most significant group appearance would be to the 12, which is attested not only in the old tradition delivered by Paul and vouched for by him who had personal contact with the 12, but is also found in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Luke. Now, what about the 500 brethren that Paul mentions? I think that the footnote that Paul adds, so to speak, to this resurrection appearance is significant. He says he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, and then he says, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, that is, have died. Now, what this shows is that Paul was familiar with who these people were. He knew that some of them had died in the interim, but that most of these people were still about. And Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are there to be questioned. The listing of witnesses was the most important attestation of historicity in the ancient world. And this is the procedure that Paul uses of listing the witnesses to the resurrection appearances. And he notes of the 1 to the 500 that most of them are still about at the time of his writing to the Corinthians in AD 55. Now, this appearance could well be mentioned in the Gospels. It could be the mountaintop appearance in the 28th chapter of Matthew on the mountain in Galilee. This is the only resurrection appearance that was by appointment. The disciples went to the mountain where Jesus had appointed to meet them. And you remember it was in Galilee. The thousands had flocked to hear Jesus give the Sermon on the Mount and to teach the crowds. And I think it's not at all improbable that 500 brethren might have gathered on that mount in Galilee where they witnessed that resurrection appearance that Paul refers to in this old tradition.
So one thing that I wanted to point out, and I've made a whole video about this, is when he says that claim is not evidence, I think that's honestly just silly. Like it's not something that we should take seriously. If my daughter came home one day and was like, "Daddy, someone hit me at school today," I would take that seriously. I would be calling the school. I'd try to figure out what happened. Like I would take that as very good evidence that something happened and that she was hit. I would take her claim as very good evidence. And so I think it's just honestly bonkers that someone could say that a claim is not evidence. But then it seems like he wants to say that a claim, like one person's claim, is not evidence. But if you have a whole bunch of claims from different people, then that's evidence. Which, if that's his standard, then I think in the case of Dr. Craig's case, each of the facts that he mentions do have, like multiple attestation is in place for these facts.
Oh, yeah.
For the empty, for the burial, for the empty tomb, for the appearances, we've got multiple attestation. So I think Bart Ehrman would have to admit that we got evidence for each of these facts. So I think that, go ahead.
Well, I was agreeing and wanted to say that the comparison with figures like Romulus is fatuous. There is nothing comparable to the resurrection appearances in antiquity. And this has been demonstrated authoritatively by the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright in this massive book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. This is a treasure trove of ancient source material, pagan and Jewish, on appearances after death and resurrection and so forth. And what Wright shows is that there's nothing in either ancient paganism or Judaism comparable to the resurrection appearances of Jesus. Pagans believed that death was a one-way street, and therefore people did not come back from the dead. Now, certainly, pagans believed that you might see a ghost or you might see a vision of a dead person. But as Wright points out, for the ancient pagan, seeing a vision of a dead person was not evidence that he was alive. It was evidence that he was dead. Now, for Jews, by contrast, they believed in resurrection of the dead, but not within history. The resurrection of the dead was a corporate event that always occurred after the end of the world on Judgment Day, when the dead would be raised and God would judge people for what they had done in the earthly life. And so these resurrection appearances of Jesus are incomparable to what you find in the literature of antiquity in both paganism and Judaism.
Well, Dr. Craig, we're at about the hour mark. Unless you're burning to get to the last two clips, why don't we go ahead and end it there? I feel like this is a good place to end it.
I am happy to continue if you've got the time in view of the importance of these things, but if you need to cut it off, I understand.
No, I don't. I was just. I'd like to respect your time. So no, but yeah, let's keep on going. So we've got 2 more clips, as I mentioned. So here's clip number 7. Clip number 7 is, what is the explanation then for the facts surrounding Jesus? And so then Dr. Ehrman gives his explanation of what happened.
And what is the most likely explanation in your view for these facts? What do you think happened? Is someone lying? Is someone mistaken?
No, I don't think anybody's lying. Through this whole thing, I just think, I think a lot of atheists have this kind of binary, right? If it didn't happen, then somebody's lying about it. And that's just crazy. I mean, all of us have stories told about us that are not necessarily, sometimes we have people lying about us, but sometimes people just don't know any better. I mean, William Lane Craig thinks that I was trained as a textual critic. He honestly thinks that. He's not lying about it. He just doesn't know. I wasn't trained as a textual critic. So he doesn't know that. So people don't necessarily lie. I think in the case of the stories about Jesus, I think my opinion is that the most plausible explanation is this. We know that Paul says that he saw him, and I don't think Paul's lying about it. I think Paul saw something. He thought he saw Jesus 3 years afterwards. We have pretty good evidence to suggest that Peter was claiming that he saw Jesus. I mean, Paul says he was the first to see Jesus, and in the gospel accounts, he's one of the early. He's there. Mary Magdalene. I would suppose Mary Magdalene probably had some kind of vision of Jesus. My sense is that these three people independently saw something they interpreted to be Jesus. They maybe had a vision of some sort. They mistook an identity. They had a dream. I don't know. Something happened to them, each of them, and they told others, who told others, who told others, and the story's propagated.
Yeah, so this is interesting because what we get like his explanation of what allegedly actually happened, right? So he's got Paul, Peter, and Mary Magdalene experience individual appearances of Jesus through visions, dreams, or mistaken identity. They then told others, who told others, who told others, who told others, and then that became the Christian story. It's remarkable. It's remarkable that people believe this stuff. I don't know. I don't want to try, like, I don't want it to come across as like belittling Dr. Ehrman or anything like that. Like it's remarkable to me that people can come up with these explanations and then think that they're plausible.
Yeah. There is no doubt that these appearances of Jesus did occur. Even Ehrman himself concedes that there were individuals who saw post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And this would include appearance to the 12, the group of the 12 disciples. This is the best attested of the resurrection appearances. So the question is, how can they best be explained? Can these appearances be explained psychologically in some way? Well, here I think the difficulty is that these appearances and the explanation they gave for them contradicted Jewish beliefs in two fundamental respects. First of all, Jews believed that the resurrection of the dead was only a corporate event, not the resurrection of an isolated individual apart from the rest of the people. And secondly, they believed that the resurrection only occurred after the end of the world. So even if the disciples had had visions of Jesus, much less dreams, they would not have preached that he was resurrected from the dead. At most, they would have said that he was assumed into heaven. This is an entirely different category in Jewish thinking than resurrection of the dead. The assumption of someone into heaven is the snatching away of someone out of the space-time world into the heavenly realm. A resurrection is the raising up of the dead man, the corpse, to life in the spatio-temporal world. And the origin of the Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection requires some sort of explanation for why the disciples came to believe that he was risen from the dead on the basis of these appearances and empty tomb, rather than had simply been assumed into heaven.
What about mistaken identity? Again, I'm just like, I'm thinking about this as a possible explanation. I just can't even take it seriously. But
incredible for the overwhelming numinous quality that these appearances evidently had, that was so life-changing for these disciples. Remember when Jesus...
take Peter. Yeah, I mean, Peter was his chief disciple. Like, this guy's the one who, like, maybe he saw him in a crowd or something, and like he thought he was returned from the dead, or did he go talk to him? Did he?
Yeah, that's not credible. No one, I think, believes that would be a credible explanation of these appearances, because it doesn't take seriously how devastating the crucifixion of Jesus was for these people. They had pinned their hopes on Jesus as the Messiah, and Judaism had no idea of a Messiah who, rather than triumphing over the enemies of Israel and establishing David's throne in Jerusalem, would be brutally crucified, humiliated, and killed by his enemies. That was simply unthinkable in Judaism, nor was there any idea that Messiah would be raised from the dead. Those ideas just weren't connected at all. And therefore, the disciples were absolutely devastated by this event. It put a question mark behind everything they believed. And so these appearances had to be incredibly powerful, overwhelming events in order to transform the lives of the disciples and lead them to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, psychological visions, hallucinations could indeed be very powerful, but as I've just explained, they would not lead to belief in Jesus' resurrection, because that contradicted fundamental Jewish beliefs in at least two respects. Rather, given their Jewish first century mindset, visions of Jesus after his death would have led them at most to believe that Jesus had been assumed into heaven, glorified, and that is where they saw him. And that would cause them to look forward to the end of the world and the judgment at the last day, when they and all the righteous dead of Israel would be united in the kingdom of God. But it would not lead them to proclaim that he was already risen from the dead, contrary to Jewish beliefs.
So now, on the nature of the appearances, it seems like this is maybe an area where you would differ from, say, the work of Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, where they're going to appeal to facts that are sort of minimal, right? Where they're not going to get into much detail about the nature of the appearances. Whereas you, it seems like you want to say that, you know, we know from the nature of the appearances in the Gospels that they were very tangible, very physical. And would you include some of those facts from what we learned from the Gospels in your case?
I do think that we have good evidence that these were not merely visionary experiences, that is, say, subjective, intramental experiences, but that they were extramental experiences of an objective reality in the real world. And I say that not only on the basis of the gospel evidence, but also on the basis of Paul's evidence concerning his teaching about the nature of the resurrection body. The strategy of those who are skeptical of physical appearances is to try to drive a wedge between Paul and the Gospels with respect to the physicality of the appearances. And I think that wedge strategy can be decisively refuted. Paul believed in a physical resurrection body and therefore physical resurrection appearances just as much as those portrayed in the Gospels.
What is the evidence that Paul believed that Jesus had a resurrected body as opposed to a resuscitated body?
Well, it would be the lines in the narrative that says that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and he was buried, and then he appeared on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. The death and burial of Jesus are central to this early tradition that Paul hands on. And the appearances or that he appeared to the disciples, that requires then the fact of the empty tomb. So I think that given Paul's belief in the death of Christ, which he affirms over and over again, it's clear that he believed in Jesus' resurrection rather than just that he was resuscitated.
Because
I take it that you mean a return from someone who is apparently dead, but then they're brought back to life somehow.
Yeah, and that could also be over the course of a couple days. So like someone could be dead a couple days and then come back to life. 1
Corinthians 15 goes on to teach about the glory and incorruptibility and immortality of the resurrection body. He has the same sort of doctrine of glorified resurrection bodies that you typically find in Judaism. So he describes the resurrection body as spirit directed, immortal, incorruptible, and powerful and glorious, which is not a return to the earthly life, but a transformation of the body to a new mode of existence.
And in context, that happens immediately after the beginning of chapter 15. It happens immediately after talking about Jesus's resurrection.
Yes, you see, the reason that he recounts this early tradition to prove that Jesus rose from the dead is because there were people in Corinth denying the eschatological at the end of the world. For what reason, we don't know, but they didn't believe in the resurrection at the last day. And so what Paul wants to say is that if Christ has not been raised, then the dead are not raised, and yet Christ has been raised, and this
Right.
is our guarantee that we too will someday be raised from the dead.
And so then the whole question is, what does it mean to be raised? What does it mean to be
Yes.
raised? And then
Right.
and then he's
He
describing what it means
describes
to be raised
that
in 15.
graphic
in 15.
terms.
Right. All right. Let's move on to clip number 8. This is our last clip for today's stream. This has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed the stream today. And as you say, this is a really important topic. So I'm really appreciative of you coming on to do this with me today. So
Sure.
here's clip number 8. Here we go.
This kind of thing happens all the time.
And so when you get both the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, but I guess not in Mark, but you do get a sort of an anticipation of a group appearance in Mark at the end of Mark, but 2 of the Synoptic Gospels and in John, when we have a sort of written account of a group of people physically in a room seeing the figure of Jesus. Is this just a story that sort of develops out of nowhere? I mean, if this event didn't occur, but shows up in all of these
It doesn't
Gospels.
occur out of nowhere. It occurs because people are saying, I've seen Jesus.
But if you think it's plausible that individuals might have seen Jesus,
Yes.
and maybe there are some sort of ideas floating around that, this person thought they saw Jesus, this person thought they saw Jesus, but the idea of a group of disciples sort of all getting together in a room, some of them saying that they've seen Jesus, and Jesus appearing to sort of vindicate his resurrection to them, is this the sort of thing that can just sort of develop? Is this sort of like a...
How do rumors start anyway? I mean, how do rumors start that, 1,000 people saw this thing? 20 people saw this UFO. Well, where does that come from? It's not that somebody's lying about it, and it's usually not that 20 people saw it. So it just happens. That kind of thing happens when you tell stories. But I want to insist that we don't have any of these group members saying that it happened. The other thing we haven't pointed out is you can't just take the Gospels at face value for this, because when you compare their narratives of the resurrection, they're more contradictory than the stories of the birth narratives. We don't have a consistent, independent narrative. What we have are independent narratives that contradict each other, that are all written 40, 50, 60 years later by people living in a different part of the world who didn't know any eyewitnesses, who aren't even speaking the same language. I mean, so what do historians do with sources like that? They don't simply accept what they say because they happen to agree with their religious views. They evaluate them in light of what we know at the time, their consistency, even though if they collaborated with each other. These are the kinds of things that historians do. When you do that with these sources, I just don't think that you make a compelling case.
Okay. So yeah, so to quickly summarize there, how does anything get made up? And he says this thing kind of happens when you tell stories. We don't have any of these group members saying that it actually happened. And then you can't take the Gospels at face value because when you compare the accounts, they're contradictory. And then as historians, we've got to figure out what actually happened.
Yeah, he's certainly right that historians don't just take it at face value, but they will explore the credibility of the accounts that we have. And when they do that with regard to the Gospels, as I say, we have multiple independent attestation, not only of these various appearances, such as to the 12, but also of the honorable burial and the empty tomb of Jesus. And for that reason, Ehrman is an outsider with respect to what most New Testament historians believe about these facts. As for the so-called contradictions, what these concern are minor secondary details in the narratives. It doesn't touch the historical core, which is what I've described in our podcast today in talking about these 4 events. So while there may be differences among the narratives and the circumstantial details, the historical core of the traditions is remarkably consistent and is multiply and independently attested in extremely early sources that go back to within the first decade after Jesus' crucifixion.
When I heard this, I was thinking, like, imagine, again, going back to like a court case example, imagine you have 2 witnesses and both of them tell stories that mostly line up, but then they have like contradictions in the secondary or minor details. And then you hear that and you realize, okay, well, actually, this person says that the lights were on, this person says that the lights were off. They both saw the same person run out, but the lights, there's a situation with the lights. Like, would you throw out all the testimony at that point? No, you wouldn't throw out the testimony. You wouldn't just be like, okay, both these guys are unreliable. Let's get rid of these guys. Let's just rely on other evidence, or just throw it all out. Like if that was the only evidence that we had, like suppose that the cameras weren't working at that time. Like it's just remarkable again to me that you would just disregard everything just because you find a couple contradictions like that. That's the option that you go to. It just strikes me as it's just odd.
It occurs to me, Cameron, that in one sense, Ehrman has never really shed his fundamentalist upbringing. He still seems to have the idea that the exposure of one inconsistency or one contradiction in the narratives leads you to throw the whole thing out and calls everything into question. And he ought to know that's not the way historians work.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. But so as we wrap up the show today, that's all the clips that we've got. Is there anything that you'd like to say about the clip overall as we sort of wrap everything up?
Just that I think that Ehrman does a great job of calmly and confidently presenting his aberrant views so that unsuspecting laymen could well be deceived by what he's saying. And I hope that folks have been able to see that credible scholars like N.T. Wright and others that I've referred to have a quite different view of the matter than does Bart Ehrman. He is an outsider. He's in the tiny minority in denying things like the burial and empty tomb of Jesus and the appearances to groups. And I hope folks will not be deceived by what he's saying.
Well, thank you, Dr. Craig, for joining me today.